We are in an age of personalization. If you want to personalize properly, it invariably means you need to get to know your children better. You need to get to know them beyond the grade. We've moved away entirely from the accountability to the child. We're accountable to the system. The word child is almost not mentioned at all. And it strikes me as bizarre. It strikes me as, it's like talking about hospitals without mentioning patients, although I suppose we're not far off that either, really. And somebody needs to explain to me at some point how children and young people not being allowed to speak on corridors, how that is preparing them for the world of work. I've never been in a place of work where you're not allowed to speak on corridors. We must trust the children as much as they trust us. Education is 0 to 99. Schooling is a number of years as part of that, that prepares you to educate yourself better for the rest of your life. That it is about experiences and opportunities, that it is about confidences, that it is about creating the space for young people to get it wrong and then learn to get it right. We need to remember as teachers that we are not in charge of numbers, but we're in charge of people. We set examples, we set the tone. I can't think of a sadder thing to do for 10, 15 years, is doing something because you have to. So we have failed not to give them the why answer, but to let them find the why answer. Bring me a confident learner and I'll bring you whatever grade you want. We have a system at the moment that is, since Ofsted in the early 1990s, that is entirely built on the fact that we can't trust anybody, least of all the children. We're brilliant.
Hello and welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be chatting to Professor Dr Ger Graus OBE. Now we're talking about someone who has been involved in education for many years, someone who's got some amazing thoughts and insights, and I think for me the biggest impact is the fact that as a non-educator myself, as a musician, as someone who works in music education, it's very easy for me to be sort of blasé about, well, education could just look like this. Isn't it obvious about that, not having the nitty-gritty understanding of what it's like in the classroom on a day-to-day basis? But chatting to Ger is always amazing because he cuts away all of that. And I think we have a sort of a kindred spirit in what is possible and the conversations that should be happening. And I'm delighted to be able to share his book, which is out on the 11th of April, 2025. And it's called Through a Different Lens, Lessons from a Life in Education. Now, I think there's so much that we could talk about going into it in this introduction, but all I want to say is this, which I think epitomizes really exactly the heart of everything that we discuss. Children can only aspire to what they know exists. So my question to you is going to be, so that being said, what do you think our children are learning in school and what are their real experiences? I really hope you love this conversation as much as I did. Thanks so much for being here and being part of this community. Hi, Ger. Thank you so much for joining us again here on the Education on Fire podcast. Great to have a continual conversation in terms of what your work has been involved in and what you're doing in supporting children in education. And I think this conversation of having a book, having somewhere where the voice of children articulated in one place is such a special thing. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark, again. And it's good to see you.
So start us off. What's the name of the book and how did it come about?
So the title in the end is Through a Different Lens, Lessons from a Life in Education. It was going to be called Views with the Benefit of Hindsight, but we settled on Lessons from a Life in Education. And I suppose Through a Different Lens is partly to do with my glasses, which are on the front cover as well. Basically, people heard me speak over a period of time at conferences and events, and every time they'd come up afterwards and say, well, you need to write this down, and why aren't you writing a book? And my answer really is I don't like writing very much. And so Bruce Roberts, the editor at Routledge, kind of persisted for a while and then went away again. And then Rebecca, the managing director at Westchester, came back, and between the two of them, they kind of persuaded me that it would be a good idea. And actually, I really enjoyed the process and the way we did it, because I didn't actually initially write it. We just recorded lots of conversations, and then we transcribed those, and we decided on a number of chapter titles. And I decided very early on that I wanted to reflect and think about children, really. And because to me, education and schooling, two different things, although connected, the accountability is to the child. And over a number of years or decades, even in this country, but particularly in the last 15 or so years, we've moved away entirely from the accountability to the child. We're accountable to the system, we're accountable politically. We've moved away from local democracy in terms of local authority, controlled schools, as it used to be called, into something that are quangos, that are not elected, that have no democratic representation. And the word child, if you read the articles and you read all the stuff that goes on, including the Ofsted reviews, etc., the word child is almost not mentioned at all. And it strikes me as bizarre. It strikes me as it's like talking about hospitals without mentioning patients, although I suppose we're not far off that either, really. So that became the angle. And the other angle, I suppose, is that you can't divorce, as a teacher, as somebody who works with children, you can't divorce, however much you're told to, you can't divorce the personal from the professional. I mean, simply the question, why did you become a teacher? When people open up about those questions, they become personal stories. So we decided to write down stories, basically, and it was good fun, and it's been well received. And I remember Bruce Roberts asking me the question, well, who is it for? And my answer was anybody who likes children. And when will they read it? And hopefully on their way to on their holidays in the summer or whenever, because sometimes we write books. And I always think about management and leadership, for example, and it's almost like you're forced to read them because somebody's written that. And I really didn't want that. I just wanted people to reflect. And I was delighted when as part of the reviews, my good friend Sergei Kozaretsky, who was a professor at the National Research University in Moscow, came up with this comment, which is in the book somewhere, which says that Ger Graus stands for me, along with Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and Gianni Rodari, as the best broadcasters of the children's voice. So I'm having that engraved, and that's going to go on a door somewhere. I think that'll do me. And that's where we're at, really. Literally, that's where we're at. And I suppose the message is that we need to listen more to stories. More people need to tell them. We need to recognize their value. And that in schools, perhaps I would urge leaders in schools to make one of their training days, whatever they call, available for teachers and non-teaching colleagues to talk about children. Not about Ofsted and not about the DFE and not about this, that, and the other, but just about, because we all teach in a school, in a secondary school, for example, many of us teach the same children. And we always talk about the subject, but we never kind of talk about how does it work for you and what are the tricks that you apply. And I've got them Friday lesson 5 and it's a bit of a nightmare. And those kind of things. And that takes me back to my days when I moved as a teacher from my first school in Norwich, a small, reasonably affluent area, small school, to a very large school in Hull, which was in a very disadvantaged area. And we persisted, and quite rightly, in teaching languages for all. So I had a faculty of 17 or 18 staff, one of the largest in the country at the time. And we were all very good subject specialists. But the bit that we hadn't really thought through well enough was that all of us only ever taught about the top 25% of those children, whatever that top 25%, you know. And And within 3 weeks, I was knocking at the door of the head of English saying, Paul, can we come and sit in the back of your classes and see? Because we're brilliant teachers of French and German and Spanish, but we've got a little way to go in terms of becoming brilliant teachers of children. And the stories and the dialogue need to lead to that improvement. And I'm afraid training days about the Ofsted framework just don't do that, because you don't talk about the youngsters. And in an age of personalization, as Ken Robinson used to say, the Industrial Revolution 1.0 is gone. We don't need mass schooling for mass employment anymore. We are in an age of personalization. If you want to personalize properly, it invariably means you need to get to know your children better. You need to get to know them beyond the grade. And that, in a sense, is, I suppose, is what the book's about to a very significant degree.
I think the reason this strikes such a chord with me is because, this podcast started with me sharing information, insights, organizations that I thought were doing great things within education, and the person in the staff room who felt like they were unsupported, banging their head against a brick wall, might understand or feel some kind of support from that person, even if they're in a school down the road or a different county or even a different country for that matter. But it did relatively quickly change to having the child at the center of it, because I couldn't, in the same way as you're talking about, I couldn't sort of separate those things out, because if I'm a mentor or I'm doing a club or I'm interested in a child in whichever way that happens to be, even as a parent, that has an impact and influence in terms of who I am and also how I'm going to talk to a child, how I understand their overall learning environment and all of those sorts of things. And so it couldn't be that specific, because actually it's the whole, isn't it? It's the fabric of everything, which is actually going to have the biggest difference in their lives, I think.
And I think the starting point has to be that however we qualify disadvantage, poverty is, of course, is a major cause of disadvantage. We have to always remember that this was never the child's choice. Right? And I'm afraid that certainly, as I say, in the last decade or so, some of the language around these children has become very ugly and very about control. And somebody needs to explain to me at some point how children and young people not being allowed to speak on corridors, how that is preparing them for the world of work. I've never been in a place of work where you're not allowed to speak on corridors. So I'm not quite getting that. And I think there are issues about trust. And my very good friend Carlo Rinaldi, the president of Reggio Children, the Fondazione, the early years organization, always uses that phrase that we must trust the children as much as they trust us. And that may not always be easy, but I think, and particularly in secondary education, we are failing in that respect very badly. And some of the horror stories that are coming out about young people being controlled as to when they might go to the toilet or not, I can't even begin to imagine that we've gone back that far. And it needs to stop. And if in reading the book, one or two people begin to see that there are other ways of doing it, then I'd be delighted, right? But it needs to stop. That nonsense needs to stop.
And you bring up a really important point, and I've never got to the bottom of this, is that do we think that the education system, specifically in the West, but I mean, let's talk about the UK as we're here at the moment. Like you said, Industrial Revolution, learning was important. There was a reason for doing it in order to have skilled, educated people doing certain things to help the country do what they need to do. So if you carry that forward, schools would already look completely different, because the skills, the understanding, the world they live in now is very different, but it hasn't changed in that way. So do you think actually it's now, like you said, maybe more about control, about the fact that the government needs to, it's gone down this route of sort of assessment and SATs and exams and that kind of thing. And actually, if you suddenly had a whole system where people were thinking for themselves, they were learning for themselves, they had this freedom, there would be no control. There's no way of understanding what's going on. And it's actually, that's the reason we've gone so far away from learning and supporting children to be who they need to be, because as a society, whether it's childcare, whether it's just assembling the world in the way that it is, we can't get ourselves out of it, and no one's got enough time to do that because there's an election again in another 4 years. And so even if you want to be radical, the chances are you're never going to be able to fulfill that idea.
No, so there's a couple. That's a very, very series of valid points. There's a couple of points on this. One is we need at some point. I know in two-party states that's very difficult, but we need consensus and compromise, right? Because actually, a child's schooling goes beyond the lifetime of one parliament. So that first and foremost. So at some point, these political people need to come together and seek the right expertise and decide between them what it is they really want. That's first and foremost. Secondly, one of the things, of course, that the Industrial Revolution and schooling did was it made schooling an economic factor much more than a societal factor. As Billy Connolly so wonderfully put, he went to school in Glasgow at the age of 14. The school gates opened, and at the same time, the gates to the shipyard in the Clyde opened, and you just moved from one to the other. And if you wish, societal schooling, the wider experience, was only for those who went to fee-paying schools, the top 7, 8, 9, 10%. Now we've moved on. We're into the age of personalization, but we're still mass schooling. And I think we need to bravely distinguish between schooling and education. Education is 0 to 99. Schooling is a number of years as part of that prepares you to educate yourself better for the rest of your life. And the simple fact that we're having debates around whether to allow mobile phones into schools or not demonstrates the lack of trust, it demonstrates the lack of vision, it demonstrates the obsession with control. I'm a language teacher. My young people used to write letters to their pen friends. It took a week to write the letter, and it took a week for the letter to get to Germany. And it took a week for the youngsters in Germany to read it, and another week to respond, and another week to get back. And remember, you don't have email trails, right? So by the time it got back, they'd forgotten what they wrote in the first place. My lesson would start now in German, of course, by asking them whether they've got their phones with them and whether they're charged up. We're going to set up some WhatsApp groups, and we're going to make this life instant, challenging. I just think we just need to grow up, because the other thing that's beginning to happen is that you got these youngsters who are coming to school on their phones. They're absolutely everywhere. They might be in Brazil. They might be God knows where. And then at 9 o'clock, we tell them that they need to go back to the 1950s. And at 3 o'clock, then they can get in their little time machines again and come back to 2020. I think we need to have a proper discussion as to what we want. I am concerned about the increasing economic angle, because what it does is it narrows the subjects. Yeah? STEM is ever so important. And well, actually, so are the arts, and so are the humanities. And we have to also remember that the schooling agenda suits. So the schooling agenda essentially is a government deciding what children should be taught. They call that a national curriculum. And then what we do is we test how well the children have been taught. And we inspect how well the children have been taught. We're not necessarily testing what they've understood or what they're going to do with what they've understood. And sometimes my dear old grandfather used to say that politicians hate well-educated societies because they might not vote for Brexit, as an example, right? I think we need to be much more courageous about the education. And typically what also happens is that we are making economic rather than educational decisions. So we have, by and large, small primary schools. In primary schools, the personalization bit works really well, because most of the primary schools, I know most of the staff, know most of the children, and know something good or funny or endearing or brilliant about those children, something wonderful. And then they go to those large secondary schools, and the words economies of scale begin to creep in. And actually, increasingly, we move away from that child, and they become a barcode and the robotification of those youngsters. And then we start to believe our own hype, and we call it outstanding. I mean, we have to remember that in inspection terms, if a school is outstanding, what that actually means is that they're outstandingly compliant. They tick the boxes really well. I said to head teachers, please don't go and buy the banners. Put something like wonderful outside or hopeful or whatever it is, but please don't buy the banners. Please don't play the game because it's quite meaningless. And I think we need to have a debate, a professional debate, whereby teachers and non-teaching colleagues are heard about what they think. And so, for example, the big listen that Ofsted in the United Kingdom and in England wasn't a big listen at all. It was nobody listened to anything. Because when I'm seeing what the outcome is, there's been no recognition of anything, least of all, the life of Ruth Perry. So I think we need to just start to say it a little bit more as it is, and that the schooling and education of our children is more, that children learn outside of school, that it is about experiences and opportunities, that it is about confidences, that it is about creating the space for young people to get it wrong and then learn to get it right, as opposed to mark them down with a red pen. And so I think the picture's bleak at the moment. It is bleak more so in secondary than in brilliant primary schools, and it is concerning.
And so that draws again on what you were saying, because if you have a family setup, whatever that looks like, that understands that's the case, then either you're going to be very selective about where you send your child to school, or you're going to assume we can't do anything about this, but outside of school we can pay for whatever it is that we can afford in terms of, like, say, whether it's art, sports, whatever the extracurricular or curricular but not in school situation happens to be. And again, you then get a divide from those that can afford that and those that can't afford that, and people who are educated and understand and want to have these conversations as opposed to people who don't. And so that just sort of gets worse and worse and worse, doesn't it? So in terms of assuming that the government doesn't suddenly change what it's trying to do, and as children, we understand that actually they want their life to look different because they understand the pitfalls and they understand the restraints they're in. And, you know, you only have to talk to a child to understand that how their life looks, having been through school of however many years, isn't supporting them. In a world of AI, in a world of mobile phones, in a world of understanding that they can actually do their own learning, how do you think that can take a step forward in terms of having that more direct support for them and them taking ownership of their own education in a way that can be supportive from an academic point of view, an emotional point of view, a developmental point of view?
I think that's a very valid point. I think what we need to do, though, we need to be very careful with the technology bit because we make promises that we can't keep. Right? So technology is not the answer. It is a means to a solution. And the simple fact that the COVID period taught us so much, or should have taught us so much, and I'm not so sure how much we've learned, but the issue around, if you are from a poor area, if you're disadvantaged, and your child, your 3 children, 2 children, whatever, have one device between them, and they need to operate from a dongle that the school has provided because you can't afford the internet connections at home, your chances of utilizing what AI can bring you are limited. And it's a very interesting discussion about state education we never have, because I think it gets suppressed by all politicians. The bottom line is there are quite a lot of young people who go to very advantaged schools, state schools, in advantaged areas. And then there are a lot of young people who go to disadvantaged state schools in disadvantaged areas. Yet we pretend that that whole state thing, that choice exists. So it's a postcode lottery. So at some point in this debate, for example, around VAT on independent schools or not, it was disingenuous. I'm not particularly bothered whether VAT goes on it or not. But if you are going to have a discussion around this, you have to have a proper discussion, including the whole picture and not just picking on the bits that you like and don't like. And the technology for me is really important. So the first focus of any government should be equity and access. Technology has the potential to be singularly the most democratizing a factor that we know. But we need to we need to create the infrastructure for that to happen. Then we need to invest in almost in the areas of the most disadvantage. They require the highest levels of investment. So we need to look at formulas, and we need to not just have a formula whereby London children are worth much more than the rest of the country, but we need to start to be honest and make that fairer. We need to give roles to schools in advantaged areas, including the independent sector, to actually lend a helping hand. We need to unpick this. So I think technology has tremendous potential, but if we're not very careful about its distribution and access, actually we will achieve exactly the opposite what we're setting out to do. And again, COVID showed that, didn't it? So Gavin Williamson and his crew at the DFE were driving around handing out laptops to people who had no internet access at home. Had you talked to the local schools, you might have been given better answers and solutions. Actually, had you given the whole thing to the schools, it would have been better used. But that trust, of course, doesn't exist. So there's a lot of repair to be done. But I think we as a society, as parents, as grandparents, as neighbors, we need to stand with our schools and we need to stand with our professionals because that's what they are. And you know, I hear that discussion quite often that says, well, do you think that teachers should rank alongside doctors and lawyers, for example? And my answer is no, absolutely not. They should rank above them, because without them, there wouldn't be any doctors and lawyers. So let's just get this straight. The fact that we even have that discussion, they're singularly the good teachers, the brilliant teachers, who we all have had the privilege to meet. They open gateways, right? They make things happen. I became a German teacher because of my teacher. I am who I am today because I was really lucky to have very good teachers when I was a youngster and to have worked alongside teachers. There's a teacher, it won't mind me mentioning his name because he's in the book, Richard Taylor. He was the head of English at my very first school. And he never knew this until fairly recently. So 43 years later, he finds this out, right? I was a newly qualified teacher. I used to go and stand outside his classroom and listen to him teach Shakespeare to a bottom set, year 11, on a Friday afternoon. And these kids not wanting to leave the classroom because they wanted more Romeo and Juliet or whatever. And used to stand outside there thinking, my God, I wish I could do this. They exist today, those teachers. Give other teachers the opportunity to experience that awe and wonder of this brilliant profession, rather than tell them from on high what they should do at 10 o'clock on a Thursday. How dare they? Yeah, so I think we need to really begin to free up. And as a society, we need to stand with our teachers, not against them. Because the interest is the child. The shared interest is, Mark, I want your youngsters to enjoy it. I want them to have the best time ever. I want them to do really well. So do you. So shall we just do this together?
So where do you think these conversations or this debate needs to be? Because in my experience, you know, it might be in the staff room, it might be in the playground, it's sort of everywhere. And then we have these big events. So if we take BET, for example, I know something you've been involved in, you know, you have the whole ed tech world comes together and talks a lot about what's possible and change. And then you sort of go away again and things kind of sort of filter through. And then the next year we come back and have the same sort of conversation, but just with a little bit of tech development that's gone on. But nothing really changes. So do you sort of see a place where there is an event, something which can actually make that change? Or is it just chipping away bit by bit, like say us having a conversation today, more people hearing it, then deciding they will talk to someone about it and have a different conversation than maybe they would have done without?
I think the chipping away and its importance cannot be underestimated. You know, a gathering of like-mindedness and like-heartedness is the best thing. But I also think that we need to have conversations with people like that. You know, are you an education fair or are you a technology one? Or are you both? Well, if you're both, why have you no presence for early years? Is that because little ones are told not to go on screens? I think we need to exert those pressures. And I think, and some of those organizations will then take that on board. It needs to become, you'll be careful with the semantics here, but it needs to become almost a movement of like-mindedness. There are enough people out there. If you go on Twitter, John Cosgrove, Paul Garvey, there's loads of people out there who think like that. But it takes people like you, Mark, and the technology to bring them together. Because if we can't bring them together now with the technology and social media we have, then we're never going to do it. But it almost requires that kind of call for professional debate and actually starting to question the adjectives. I don't want to be good. I don't want to be outstanding. I want my children's teachers to be wonderful and magical and fantastic. And let's just move it on because actually, and this would be my accusation against any of the governments and Ofsted and the DFE, is that they're setting their ceiling very low, particularly when it comes to young people in disadvantaged areas. Patronizingly so. Well, come on, let's be braver.
And I think, from all the conversations I've had over the 400 odd episodes we've done, as soon as anyone talks about their teachers, at no point did they say, I thought they taught my 2 times table really well, or I learnt so much just because they'd been well trained and, it was an outstanding school according to Ofsted. It's all about the fact this person saw me, they inspired me, they made me believe that what my dreams were, what my important things in my life were, they knew, understood, and were able to help me take that next step forward. Whether they ever went into German, like I say, if it was one of your pupils or whatever the subject happened to be, it was a very personal thing, which sort of going that full circle, fits in so beautifully from what you said from the book.
And I think it's also, sorry, Mark, I think it's also that when people talk about those teachers, it is that one of the phrases that very often comes up is at least I felt that they knew me. Mm-hmm. Right? And there is that wonderful thing, I use it quite often, is that 50 years from now, if you're a teacher, 50 years from now, somebody will say your name. I guarantee you 50 years from now, somebody will say your name. What they say is up to you. Right? And I do it. My German teacher was Neil Burskens was my German teacher. I am what I am. And I had the great privilege at some point, not too many years ago, to walk into a conference room and the speaker stopped speaking and said, I'm standing here today because of the man who's just walked into this room. And I should have retired after that, really, I think, because in hindsight, I can't think of anything more. I was literally kind of blown away by that kind of stuff. But we need to remember as teachers that we are not in charge of numbers, but we're in charge of people. We set examples, we set the tone, we are role models. It's difficult in these large secondary schools. And I personally believe that if we have to pay more tax, we have to pay more tax, no problem at all. But we need to adapt the context of the schools to our children, not to the public purse. I'm sorry, if we want to get it right, everybody always talks about Finland, right? Well, you can't achieve Scandinavian standards of education funded by American levels of taxation. Doesn't work. So we need to be courageous on that front.
And I think we talked about the bigger picture, because the reality, of course, is that if we had creative young people who were loving school and learning and having an environment that they were thriving in and being given all the information and all the advice that was going to support them, you would think the economy, the businesses that would benefit from all of these people would grow, and actually it would take care of itself. But like you say, again, you need to be brave in order to set this up and have that bigger picture idea to how that may look going forward as well. And you sort of
and you need to look at the children in the COVID year, which is just from as a reminder, it's 5 years ago now. My youngest daughter's happiest day of 2020 was the day she went back to school. What a compliment to the school, right? But put that on a banner instead of whatever. And that's so we need to observe our youngsters and get insights as to what is it that they then value. And when you have the question, when I had that conversation with her, it was about her peers, it was about her teachers, it was about the learning, it was about the responsibilities that they're being given and the trust.
And that gives you everything, doesn't it then? And so
Yeah.
when you mentioned Finland there, and I know that, you talk all around the world, and you could talk about the Middle East and a lot of the education movements that are going there. Do we have things that we can learn from around the world? Are they sort of mimicking things that they think they should do? Or what's your sort of thought on that in terms of a different lens, as it were, in terms of where we are, but also where that might take us in the future?
As a Dutchman, I would say that at times the English suffer from a post-colonial arrogance still. I think there is something about everybody needs to look at what we do, and we know that that's not true. There are lessons to be learned everywhere, right? And most importantly, particularly if we keep asking the question, why? Why are they doing this? Why are they thinking this? Where has this come from? And some of the thinking that's around in the Middle East, in Sharjah, for example, one of the smaller emirates where I sit on the government's education board, where they have now declared the early years as singularly the most important aspect of their schooling system, and they are now investing accordingly, right? Because it's that thing about a longer term view. It's that thing about if you build a house and you build a strong foundation, you can go very high. And what we've done here, because of political short-termism, somebody went, well, if they do their exams at 16 and the government, and we're in power for 4 years or whatever else, let's start investing from about 13 onwards, and then we can claim the results. That's what it feels like, right? And so the longer term view, the accountability towards the child, you look at what goes on in Malaysia, for example, at Segi University, which is now basically gone, well, we're a university and we're academic, but at the end of the day, all of our youngsters need to be successful in society. So we were going to make it mandatory that there are vocational elements for every student, whatever you study, that you have experience so that you can better make up your mind when you've achieved your degree or whatever. I think there are absolutely things worth looking at, not least, and of course, ironically, that this whole teach and test thing, which was kind of made worse under Gove and his acolytes at the time. And I remember, we must all be like Singapore. Well, I wish we were now, because Singapore has taken the route to say, well, the teach and test thing's no good. We're going to seek different routes, including experiential learning and wider experiences, the relevance. I ask children wherever I travel, I meet youngsters of whatever ages, and I always ask them one question, and that is, why do you go to school? And the answer I get in about 80% of the cases is because I have to. I can't think of a sadder thing to do for 10, 15 years, is doing something because you have to. So we have failed not to give them the why answer, but to let them find the why answer. And so we need to connect with in school and out of school. No child, no youngster should be taught Shakespeare in a school if the end product is not the experience of the play, either to be in it or to sit in the theatre. Shakespeare would be turning in his grave. So we need to look at the learning rather than just the teaching. And then people go, oh, we haven't got the time. Make the time. Don't give me that. Make the time.
Yeah. And
so I think it's that, Mark, that we need to look at. And in that sense, each country does something really well. Where we need to be very careful is that we don't treat the educational provision or the schooling provision as something that you can pick up off the shelf. You then need to think, will that work for my youngster? And actually, even within a relatively small country like England, one size does not fit all, right? Absolutely. So we need to contextualize within that too. And then we have a real chance that slowly we will lift the floor.
I think that's so important, and I really liked that idea of the experience, because and also, like say, within the situation that you're in, because if you're living in London, you can go into the Globe, or if you live in Stratford,
Yeah,
you can go and watch a Shakespeare
yeah,
at the highest level. If you're living much further away, that's a very different prospect,
yes,
and so, like I say, you have to frame what the outcome's going to be or what you want to do,
yeah,
and also, like I say, over the amount of time that you're teaching that child, because it might be that you can get to Stratford at one time, whereas
yeah,
if your school's down the road, you could go every year. But that isn't to say that each child won't get the benefit of that and they're learning from that,
exactly.
because you get that personalized ear. And as a musician, the only reason I became a professional musician, I can talk about my teachers, I can talk about those experiences, but when I started secondary school, we had to learn an instrument, and our music lessons were a wind band. And without that experience, and knowing the reason that I was going to have an individual lesson on playing the drums was because on a Tuesday, period 3, or whatever it happened to be, I was going to be sat in the hall with everyone else who'd had their individual lessons, and we got to feel what it was like to be a musician. And that's the same feeling I can remember then as it is when I'm in the Albert Hall playing with an orchestra. And if you know
Totally.
that you can actually get all of that starting at that point, that would be the advice that I would share. It's not about what's going to happen in 10, 20 years. It's about what you're experiencing now and how you can expand that and support people to do more of it.
And that became so evident through the work when I started at Children's University, and we had evaluations done, that essentially the journey was not the youngster became better at maths or became better at English or became better at this. The journey was that the youngsters who participated voluntarily in out of school hours learning activities, fun activities, became more confident learners. They became less risk averse. And the minute, well, I don't know, bring me a confident learner and I'll bring you whatever grade you want, really. Because so that journey has been cut short by saying, well, I'll teach it to you. I'll give you the knowledge that you need to regurgitate. And we need to get back from this. So in a sense, we need to reinvent educational apprenticeships. Every child an apprentice. And that doesn't mean going to work in a factory. It means an educational, a thinking and a feeling apprentice. Their passion. We need to give our children the opportunity to become passionate about what they're learning. And then you've got them, right? The buy-in is there. The world's your oyster.
Yeah. And it's such an important thing, and it's something I'm sure all of us can identify with, in terms of either, yes, because I've been able to step forward into my life in that way, or I still have that feeling, but I don't have the opportunity. I don't have the time. I've decided I wasn't able to. I wasn't given the support. I thought I could go down this route, but I was told I had to do this because, like I say, school or wherever it happened to be, society said it's not possible for you to do that. And I love the fact that this just keeps bringing me back to the same thing, which is that we just need to have conversations about it, because if enough people are talking about it in a different way, even if the system is so tight and so not working at the moment, you'll find another person that will show you a different way, open an opportunity that's going to allow you to do that. And I think that's a really exciting prospect in terms of what we can do here and now. And
remember that stories are trips and visits. So I often say to teachers, I do some work. I'm a professor at the University of Cumbria, and I do some work with with a large group of teacher training students. And one of my messages to them constantly is, at the point where you have to explain an abstract, whatever that is, whichever subject, once you've mentioned the abstract and you've done the theory around that abstract, what should happen next is, comma, for example. It's really easy. So not everything is about expensive visits. Sometimes the visit is a for example. My maths teacher, if A is 3 and B is 4, what is C? I don't even know what you're talking. I don't know the language. Right? But if at that point he'd gone to a 12 or 13-year-old boy, Johan Cruyff is known as Pythagoras in boots, I'd have been hooked. Mark, I'd have been hooked for life, right? And it is that mix of knowing your youngsters and putting the comma and the for example in the right place as a teacher. And of course the visits matter and the experiences. And you can bring experiences into school. Bring expertise and visitors into school, but make the experience happen. That's the important bit.
And we won't go down to this now because it just drives me mad. But even if you just think about what a school looks like now with a 10-foot fence and all of that kind of stuff, they're not inviting in either way, in terms of the way that works.
And there are incidentally some brilliant inconsistencies. So a friend of mine, John Cosgrove, has just written a blog, and he talks about schools taking youngsters on skiing trips in school time. But if the parent wants to take them out of school, take them on a skiing trip, they get fined. So the educational experience cannot be the same. I think, again, we just need to rethink this. So the KidZania in Tokyo, and museums in Japan as well, if you take your child out of school and take them to a place that has been approved by the ministry, counts as a school day. You don't get penalized. You get a pat on the back. Brilliant. Well done, parent. Fantastic. We need to rethink that bit as well. But it keeps going back to trust, doesn't it? So we have a system at the moment that is, since Ofsted in the early 1990s, that is entirely built on the fact that we can't trust anybody, least of all the children. Well, brilliant. Look where we've ended up. And that's the shift that we need.
Mm. And you mentioned COVID a couple of times before, and I think the lack of change since then really just highlights, we had the opportunity and the situation where we could have really sort of rewritten everything if we wanted to, or at least understood the limitations of that and how we might move forward, and the speed that it was back to normal. Even though that normal isn't forward thinking or anything, was just incredible. And I think again that just goes back to we need to have these conversations with the people that do want to have those things, just to make it more of the fabric of, we'd like it to change if we can, but we can't, but actually it can change and is changing. Let's showcase what that looks like and how that can work now, as well as the bigger picture to those things.
We rushed so badly to get back to 2019, it was embarrassing.
It really was. So just before we wrap up, obviously the acronym FIRE is so important to us in terms of feedback, inspiration, resilience, and empowerment. What is it that strikes you when you see that, either one particular thing or as a whole?
So when you send me your email with suggestions, that was the one that struck me most. So what essentially happened is that I looked at them all, and I was kind of forced to look at them all. Having written that book over what was an almost 3-year period, the final manuscript went off on the 4th of December of last year to the publishers. And on the 7th of December, I went for a minor checkup in hospital, just a standard routine thing, to be asked to stay behind and to be told that I have cancer of the esophagus. And I'm now coming towards the end of my first chemotherapy cycle. Then there'll be an operation and I'll be more chemo. And I've been thinking a lot about the book, and because what reflection does, kind of views with the benefit of hindsight, if you wish, is it does make you prioritize. It makes you prioritize people you've met, things that have happened, and it helps you put ducks in a row sometimes and explain things. So now I'm going through this thing, obviously with my family and with my friends, and I think that the process of reflection and writing this book that I was never going to write has made me better at prioritizing, has made me more resilient and more determined. So I suppose I'll never know, but I think my view at the moment is that because of that process, I'm coping with this much better than I would have done otherwise. And one of the conclusions I kind of reached, which sounds very obvious, but my conclusion at the end of the book, because what then happened, I asked the publisher to send me the manuscript back, and I altered one or two things, and I wrote another couple of paragraphs in it. My conclusion at the end of the book really was that there's an awful lot of life left to be lived. And I think it was the reflection from my grandfather to my teachers, to my family, to my friends, to my travels that have led me there. So I think reflection and the benefit of hindsight. And it's interesting, isn't it? We often in English use that as a negative. The benefit of hindsight, I would have done it differently. My question to many teachers would be, with the benefit of hindsight, what would you have done the same? And so that's where I've kind of ended up in this. There's this feedback bit, there's the inspiration that you take, there's the resilience that you develop, never on your own, you do it as a team effort. And so I think it's been an empowering, genuinely an empowering experience. There will never be a second one, because I promise I still don't like writing that much, Mark. but I am, because of what's happened recently, I'm actually grateful to the people who made me write it, really. So perhaps professionally and personally, I'd advise people that they need to build in time for reflection. Just give your teachers and your colleagues a chance to sit and think for a bit. Think about the youngsters, think about themselves, and actually set them a positive. Think about how wonderful teachers are. Wonderful. It's the best profession. It's filled with the best people.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, for writing the book. And I think that's a perfect way to finish. And it just, like you said, it feels like the starting point, I think, for so many people to feel empowered to actually take that time, have those thoughts, work out how they want their education life to look in relation to the young people that they're supporting. And hopefully these conversations, like we say, can chip away, and there can be many more of them, and we can bring them together to make lasting change. Yeah, thank you so much indeed for being here.
Mark, thanks for having me, and I'll see you soon, hopefully.
Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.